All right, I am now very honored to introduce our presenter today. Dr. Elaine Allensworth is the Lewis-Sebring Director of the University of Chicago Consortium on Chicago School Research and a research professor at the Crown School of Social Work, where she has conducted research on educational policy and practice for over 25 years. Her research examines factors influencing students' educational attainment, school leadership, and school improvement. She works with policymakers and practitioners to bridge research and practice, serving on panels, policy commission, and working groups at the local, state, and national levels. Her research on the factors that predict whether students will drop out of high school has shifted the conversation from factors that schools cannot control to factors that schools can influence. School districts across the country have adopted early warning indicator systems based on her research. Her work on school leadership has documented the ways in which organizational structures in schools influence improvements in student achievement. Dr. Allensworth has been the principal investigator on research grants from funders such as the Institute of Education Sciences, the National Science Foundation, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She has received a number of awards from the American Educational Research Association for outstanding publications. She holds a PhD in sociology from Michigan State University and was once a high school teacher. Thank you so much, Elaine, for joining us, and I will let you take it away.
Okay, thank you, Melissa. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here with you today, talking about this book that's going to be coming out in, I think, October. As Melissa was saying, I have been studying schools and looking at school data for over 25 years now. I'm at a research practice partnership here in Chicago. We work closely with the Chicago Public Schools. I'm just constantly looking at school data, the data that people are using in schools, and looking at how people are using data, especially here in Chicago, but also in schools across the country. So this is my book that's coming out about using data effectively in schools. And my whole aim is to see better outcomes, right? So that students are, having more success in school, and that educators are feeling more effective. The book is really about the how and the what. So the how in terms of how are you working with data, and the what in terms of what data are you using. So it starts off a little bit with the how, where I talk about designing the school to reach the vision that you have for your students. And I don't think about data use as something that happens in, say, a principal's office or a district office, where you're looking at data and deciding what other people should do, right? I think about data use as something that happens all across the school community. So you have teachers working with students and families, creating data, developing data and working with data, grades, test scores, attendance, all those kinds of pieces of data that that teachers are using. Then you have teacher teams, staff teams that are working together using data to support each other in terms of instructional improvement or improving supports for students in the school. Then you've got your school leadership teams that are supporting all those other teams, right? Your school leadership supporting your teacher teams and your staff teams, and looking at kind of process data and looking at data across the whole school and how the structures are, how the school is organized to really support those teams to use data. And then you've got, the school principal and you've got the central office that are looking at data on schools, school-wide data, to think about how to better support individual schools. So you've got data use kind of everywhere, and it's about everyone working together around those data. Hopefully you've got strong alignment all the way through so that all of that work is kind of, pushing towards the same kind of goals. You have coherence, and that that data is really being used to foster communication and collaboration. So, I always think, data use should not be something that you're doing on top of everything else that's going on in schools, which is a lot, right? Data use should be part of how we run schools, that in a way that makes everyone's work easier, right? It's not something extra. It should be something that makes people more effective, to feel good about themselves, to feel like they're having success, right? So you want to use data in a way that makes everyone more effective, that makes students, have more success, that makes adults have more success. So that's kind of the vision for the book and how I want, everyone to be kind of approaching the book as you think about data use. And then it kind of goes into a lot of, the nitty gritty about data and data metrics, because what you decide to focus on in terms of the data that you use and the specific metrics in terms of how you're using that data, it actually matters a lot for whether you're going to be effective or whether you're just going to be kind of bumping your head against the wall. So I talk about different properties of data in one of the chapters. And then it goes into specific kinds of data that are used a lot in schools, and really thinks about those properties of data and how they kind of match on to a lot of the data we use. So there's a chapter on student metrics around student learning, so things like test scores and grades. And then there's a chapter that gets into all the other data that we use, data on student engagement and experiences in school, and that includes lots of different things, which I'll talk about. And then it goes into a couple chapters, and once we've talked about the what, like what are we using in terms of the metrics, then it goes into the how. How are we using data? How are we using data to set goals for the school so that we reach our vision for students? And then how are we using data to have continual improvement, right? So we're reaching those goals. And the what and the how, they interact, right? It's what works for what purpose, which I'll talk more about. Before I do that, maybe I can find out from you, like, what data do you use? And I can make sure that I'm talking about those data. So if you could just put in the chat, what is the data that you use the most and what do you use that data for? I'd just like to know. And I think others would like to know. So you can go ahead and do that. Attendance, yes. Critical, especially right now. I mean, we're all worried about chronic absenteeism. Benchmark data, map data, state testing data, assessment data, time on task for student engagement, freshmen on track, iReady, sorry, it's going really quick now. Rubrics, disciplinary data, yeah. Okay. GL assessments. Wait, what is GL assessments? Region data, CTE data, data for root cause analysis, map growth. Oh, grade level assessments, sorry, GL, yeah. Okay, retention data, oh, CTE school, yeah. So our students saying that great. Formative and summative data, SEL data, SNAP, numeracy, okay, great. Okay, informative and summative data, yeah. Okay, so I am talking about all the different kinds of data in the book. I'm not going to talk all about it. Oh, yes, thank you. Culture and climate survey data. Definitely talk about climate and culture survey data because I feel like it's critically important. Student voice is going to give you the best and most important information that's going to help guide practice. Short cycle formative assessments, teacher evaluation data. Yeah, all of those data sources are really, really important. Pre-post assessments. Okay. You can keep putting things in. I'm going to move on. And while you put those in, I'm just going to give you an example from Chicago and my experience. Because, I think a lot of times people think you can't have big change, you can't see dramatic improvement. And I'll say in my work, working with schools over the last 25 years, I have seen that if you have the right data and the right data systems, you can completely transform students' experiences and outcomes in school. So I'm just going to talk about Chicago for a bit, because that's where I'm from and that's where I've seen, some of this dramatic work. Chicago, in case you don't know, it's a highly segregated city. It's segregated by race, ethnicity, income, parents' education. And when I started doing my work back in the late 90s, early 2000s, graduation rates in Chicago were at around 50%, in the early 2000s. And if you looked at graduation rates by where students lived in the city, so there are 77 community areas in the city of Chicago. And if you look at, the percentage of students who graduate based on where they live in Chicago back in 2003, you see that where students lived in the city really, you know, made a difference for whether they were likely to graduate from high school. So you had some communities where, 60, 70% of students graduated high school, but there were some communities where graduation rates were only about 20 or 30%, right? So students were much more likely not to graduate than to graduate. That was 2003. Oh, sorry. And so this is a figure that shows one dot for every single community area in Chicago. And you can see there's big differences across those dots, where those dots are across the communities. So this is 2019, right before the COVID-19 pandemic. But what you see is all those dots have shifted to the right. Right now, graduation rates in Chicago are about 85%, and increasingly the students who don't graduate are the students who are taking more than 4 years to graduate high school. They may have an IEP or they've had interrupted learning. So, and we have a lot of schools that are getting close to, kind of the ceiling where you're not going to see any, where you're getting close to 100%. But you can also see there's not a whole lot of variation. Like where you live in the city, it still matters, but it doesn't matter nearly as much as it used to, right? In the vast majority of community areas in Chicago, high school graduation rates are around 80 to 90%, right? So we've seen huge improvements over time in graduation rates. Many more students are graduating, even in the neighborhoods with the lowest graduation rates. They're looking like the communities that used to have the best graduation rates now, right? So we know that high school graduation is the thing that matters the most in terms of a predictor of students' life outcomes. So that makes a big difference for students' lives. But on top of that, besides the fact that we have thousands of more students graduating every year than we used to have, those students that we have, those graduates, we have so many more graduates, they actually not only we have more students graduating, they've been graduating with higher GPAs, higher ACT scores, now it's SAT scores, higher AP taking and passing rates, college enrollment rates, more students finishing a college degree within 10 years of starting ninth grade. So it's not just that students are graduating, but they're graduating with higher achievement and higher life success. And then we also see a while after we saw these big improvements in high school outcomes, we also saw elementary outcomes also improve dramatically in Chicago in terms of test gains, grades in attendance, suspension rates, student reports of their experiences in schools. Back in before the pandemic, in 2015, there was a study that showed learning gains in Chicago were at the 95th percentile of all districts in the country. There's a study that came out of Stanford that showed students in Chicago were basically, from grades 3 through 8, were gaining an entire extra year relative to what was typical. So we see this big improvement. And that's not to say that everything is all lollipops and gumdrops here in Chicago. Obviously, we've had a big pandemic, a lot of setbacks. We've had major fiscal issues. There's there's still a lot of room for improvement and things to do. But the key thing is students' lives during this period changed incredibly in terms of their outcomes, but also their experiences in school. And then that really mattered for how they did later. And when you talk to people in schools, they all talk about how they started to use data differently, how they started to focus on different metrics, and the systems they had set up to collaborate around data. So that's why I know it's possible, and that's why I know that it's really important to do. And I will say, as someone who studies school improvement a lot, there's this idea that, we're just going to find the right program or implement the right policy, and then we're going to get big improvement, right? But large-scale improvement actually requires the use of data and strong use of data within the school. It's not about just buying the right program. What we see is you actually need a strong base of data use practices to make those new programs and policies work. So if you look at, so one of the ways people might use data and evidence is to say, what are the programs that have strong evidence of effectiveness, right? And, that's a good thing to do because you want to bring in programs that have evidence that they actually work. But what when someone brings in a program and tries to replicate it, the most common outcome that happens is no improvement. Okay, because, we have different contexts. There are different, you never know, we live in this very complex society. You can bring in a program that was effective in one place, but when you bring it into your context, it may work, but it may not work. So the only way you're going to be able to make it work and find out if it's working is if you're actually monitoring that with data. Again, so you have to be constantly looking at what is happening in your school, because you can't just bring in that program. Just bringing that program, that's going to take you a long time. If you're constantly bringing in programs and they don't work, because that's the most common outcome, you're going to be trying a lot of programs and a lot of things that are ineffective until you actually finally start to get improvement. What's really more critical is that you're looking at the data and you have the people whose outcomes you want to change involved in looking at the data to start trying different things. And they might bring in that effective program, but actually look at how is that working in our school? Is it having the effects? If not, let's think about what we need to do to make those changes. Because if you're not looking at the data, you just don't know what's going to happen with that new program. So, improvement requires change. Change means looking at data so you know what's happening. Okay, so the book talks about the what are you using? And I've just kind of listed out some of the various data that you might be looking at, which is talked about in the book. And then it talks about the how you're using it. And so I've just kind of listed out some of the ways that you might be using data in your school. And so I talk about both of these things in the book. I often hear people kind of share that frustration about why there's a lack of improvement in student outcomes. Why is there so little change in the percentage of students who meet state standards or meeting proficiency, in reading or math? A lot of times the answers are actually in the metrics that we're using. It really just kinds of, we're focused on metrics that often don't give you very much information or very good information. And so if you think about all the time that it takes to do that, you really want to be focused on those metrics that are going to give you good information and that are going to be actionable and useful for your purpose. So that means not just taking the same old metrics that everyone is using and they think they know how it works, but actually really interrogating the data that you use. Okay, so let's talk about what data you use. And by the way, I feel like I'm talking a lot. Feel free to put questions in the chat or stop me at any point. Thanks. So, the book starts off talking about these properties of data and 6 properties of data. Some of them are things you've probably heard before and maybe we're not very interested in. One of them is reliability. If you've taken statistics classes, I'm sure you've talked about reliability and it might have been kind of dry, but reliability is really just how clean your data are. And whether you're getting good measurements. So there is no thing as like, oh, this is reliable, this is not reliable. Everything I talk about in terms of these properties, they're on a continuum, right? So you want to use metrics that you have faith in, you trust they're giving you real information. It's like if you're measuring your height, you might get a slightly different measurement every time you do it, but probably those differences are really small relative to how tall you are. So you think, okay, there's not a lot of error in the metric relative to what I'm trying to measure, and I can actually use that. Probably the thing that undermines reliability the most is just how good the data record keeping is. So if you have data that nobody is using, my guess is that it is not very good data, and it's not very clean. Once you start using data, then people have a reason for keeping good records and keeping it clean. It actually becomes more reliable. And there may be data that you have that you think is not very clean, but it might actually still be good enough for you to use for lots of different purposes. For example, I find a lot of times people disparage data on grades and attendance because they say, oh, teachers have different grading standards, or, people aren't keeping, good track of attendance. And often that's true, but perhaps. But I often find that despite those issues, a lot of times there's enough signal there because grades and attendance are so predictive of other things. A lot of times that there's enough signal that you actually can use it for a lot of different purposes, and it will give you information, even if it's not quite as clean as you would like it to be. And then once you start using it, it will get cleaner the more that you use it. Validity is just, the degree to which, your data is actually measuring what you think it is. What do you think? I think you should ask, what do you actually think this data is telling you? You might have a rubric in terms of, looking at, whether teachers are implementing an instructional practice in their classroom. And that might be a very highly valid metric of teachers' use of that instructional practice. It might be less of a valid metric of effective teaching in that class, right? Or of how well students are being prepared for their school the next year, right? Think about what is the evidence you have that this is really a valid metric for what you're using it for. Okay, people talk about reliability and validity all the time, but really, ultimately, we want to know that we're measuring something that matters for students in the long term. And I'm just constantly shocked at how little data there is out there about how predictive the metrics we use are of later outcomes. I'm not going to go into details, but let me just ask you, which do you think is more predictive of students' long-term outcomes? College going, not going to jail, graduating high school, schools' value add on tests, or their value add on student survey responses? The answer is their value add on student survey responses about their experiences in their school. That actually matters more for their long-term outcomes than school value add on test scores. Some people are saying survey responses. Yeah, which might be very surprising because a lot of people think, oh, we get students' college outcomes up by getting their test scores up. But there are a lot of things that are actually more predictive of later outcomes than their test scores, right? And so if we're focused on the things that are less predictive and ignoring the things that are more predictive, we're not having as much of an effect on students' long-term outcomes, on those ultimate goals we want for students, as we would if we focused on those things that are most predictive. Then there's malleability, and this is the other thing, like people do not talk about this at all, but a lot of the metrics we use, they're very, very hard to change. And so if you focus on something that's very, very hard to change, you're just going to get frustrated, right? I also see that a lot of times people set goals, but they don't look at whether, like what's the probability of actually obtaining that goal? Like how malleable is that metric that you want to change? Because you might set goals that are something that no one has ever accomplished before. And so you can set those goals, but then you're probably not going to accomplish it either. So you want to really look at how much the metric changes with concerted effort. So you can set goals that are ambitious, but also reasonable. You don't want to have too many metrics. You want to have a data system that's really focused on those metrics that are most malleable and most predictive of what you actually care about, so that it's really easy to use. And you want to have metrics that people can understand pretty easily. And then for continuous improvement, you need data that's going to be available, at least multiple times through the school year. Otherwise, you're going to have to wait a year to see if anything that you did made a difference. And so having that that regular availability of the data that you're focused on for continuous improvement is really critical. Okay, time is it. So I've talked a lot about the what in the data. I've just kind of given you little bits here and there. If you want to ask questions about the what, you can do that. Or I can just go into the how. Maybe I'll just pause for a minute in case people have like questions. I feel like I was just talking a mile a minute. So if anyone wants to has anything clarifying. I use year-end assessments, and then I can see how the goals were reached. Yeah, and year-end data is useful. So it's useful for different purposes, right? So year-end data is really useful for planning for the next school year, right? Sometimes I'll hear people say, "Oh, data that comes at the end of the year, it's not useful. It's all over. Everything's over now." But the best predictor of what will happen in your school next year is what happened last year. The data from the prior school year is, very telling about what is likely to happen if you don't do anything different, right? And so it's very useful for planning for the next year, even if it's not continually available, right? So great for school improvement planning, not so great for continuous improvement efforts. Okay, maybe I'll just keep going then, so and then we can have time to talk at the end. So a lot of the book is about the what data metrics are you using, but then it's also about the how. How do you use data, setting your vision, your goals, instructional planning, teaming in terms of collaboration, coaching. You have MTSS or early warning indicator systems, different ways for supporting struggling students. You have evaluation of your programs, your effectiveness, and then communication. Communication is really important. Okay, so when thinking about data use, and I just saw there was a question, but you know what, maybe I'll just go on and then we'll come back to the questions later. When thinking about what matters for school improvement, my colleagues and I actually did a study a few years ago that looked at what made the difference between schools that had strong instructional leaders where their staff said that they were, rated them highly on, in measures of principal effectiveness, but they were not showing change compared to schools that had, leaders where the staff rated them strongly that showed dramatic improvements in student outcomes. We wanted to know, like, what actually made a difference. They both have strong leaders that are respected. What really made a difference in whether some schools showed large improvements while other schools pretty much stayed the same. So, we looked at the schools, we talked to people there, and in the end, my colleagues came out saying, well, it's the difference between a tree and a field of flowers. So that's why I have this image here. Because that's how I think about it now, because that's what we saw when we talked to people. So when you talk to people at schools that didn't have effective practices, it was like a field of flowers, just lots of work, happening, lots of people doing lots of different things, but it was all disconnected, and people were just kind of off doing their own things, right? They couldn't talk about their school as having, a coherent vision, and, they didn't see how all the different efforts were connected together. The schools that had the improving outcomes, they're like a tree with all the work being the branches, right? So there was a clear vision. Everyone in the school could say what the vision was in the school, and they knew how their work connected to the vision. And so there are lots of teams, a lot of teacher leadership, but it wasn't, principals just handing out, oh, you do this, you do that, you're in charge of that, right? Or saying, okay, you guys figure it out on your own. It was connected, right? Everything's connected into that tree so that, teachers were using data really focused on student-centered goals, using data, looking at how their practices affected students. But school leaders were making sure, first of all, they had the time and the space to have those conversations, helping in terms of protocols, keeping people focused on the data, talking about the data, and then connecting their work to other people in the school, right? So everything ends up being connected. You don't have, kind of competing efforts in the school, right? People are learning from what other teams are doing. And there's this sense that we call it opt out instead of opt in, right? So it's not like, oh, you can do this if you want, or these people are doing this, these people are doing that. But everyone's doing it together. So teams are developing strategies to support students together, right? And then it's not like up to the individual teacher to decide, oh yeah, I'll do this, I'll do that. But they're working together, and then students are kind of like automatically given the help that they need, right? And then there's really a focus on prevention versus intervention. So prevention, a lot of times when people are designing systems to support students and using data in different ways, they focus on the students who are most obviously in need of support, right? The students whose test scores are the furthest behind, are not coming to school, half the days, or they're failing their multiple classes. Those students obviously need support. But it's going to be really, really hard to change their outcomes, right? It's going to take a lot of effort. And as you're putting a lot of effort into supporting students with the highest needs, you're going to have more and more students who are just starting to struggle, end up needing a lot of support, right? So you want to give support to students early on before they start to show really obvious signs of struggle, right? Because you're going to be the most effective with students whose outcomes could go either way, right? They have like a 50-50 chance of succeeding. So you want to set up systems so you're making sure that you're supporting those students. When you do that, it's going to be easier to support the students with really high needs who have really fallen far behind, because you're not going to have so many of those students, right? But you've got to set your school up for prevention. So again, that means really looking at using data effectively, but making sure you're kind of setting your thresholds. So it's the students who really could go either way. Now that means, of course, there are going to be students who maybe didn't need extra supports that you're giving extra supports to, but they don't need that much, right? And the idea of prevention is really about making sure that every student is kind of is helped as soon as you start seeing that they need that help. So really, it's this focus on prevention. And then finally, you want to set it up so that the people who are represented in the data are the people who are involved in using the data, right? Who are making meaning of the data and working on strategies. So this means teachers, could mean students, it could mean families, could mean, other school leaders. You can't just expect things, to tell people and say, do this and it will work. No, you've got to have buy-in. And the people who are represented by the data are the people who really understand, what is needed. They understand their experience and they understand all the different connections in terms of, any kind of change that happens is going to make with other things going on in their lives, right? So it means bringing in the people who are represented in the data to try, to figure out what does it mean to try different things and then look at the data together to figure out, what are we going to do? And it's working. So ultimately, I think of data as a tool for communication and for collaboration. And that's how you get effective data use practices and you get change in schools. So I'm going to pause and stop, and I'm going to look at the questions that I see have ended up in the chat. But also, if you want to just kind of type in, you can type in more questions or comments that you might have. But you might also want to share with people, how do you use data? How do you use it as a collaboration tool? Who's using the data? Because maybe you guys can get ideas from each other. So you guys type, and I'm going to look at what you've written so far. Whoops, I'm going the wrong way. Sorry. Okay. Sorry about that. Oh, and by the way, the presentation is going to be available. There's a question about will it be available? Yes, it absolutely can be available. Okay, I'm gonna scroll up in the chat to see what I've missed. Okay.
We had
How did
couple, Elaine, I can fill you in. We had
Yeah,
a couple of questions
thanks.
clarifying the, when you were talking about the schools that you looked at in the different schools, were the visions in those schools the same or were they different by school? And then
Different by school.
Okay, and then the same person was wondering how long each data cycle is.
Oh, yeah, those are good questions. So, yeah, each school had its own vision for, what they wanted for students and their goals for what they were working on. Some were high schools, some were elementary schools. High schools were mostly focused on post-secondary outcomes. Well, elementary schools had a number of different kinds of outcomes or a number of different kinds of goals. Oh, sorry. The second question was, so sorry.
Oh, sorry, I lost that one too. How long is each data cycle? That was the second question.
Right. Okay. So this is where I think there's these different levels, right, of data use. So, you have your yearly planning cycle where you're going to look at last year's data, which probably happens in the summer, or and at the beginning of the school year. And then you're going to want to have cycles where you're looking at process data. Well, you're going to have your planning data, also your formative data at the beginning of the year, which also might be using data from the prior year. And then you'll want to have cycles for improvement, to come up with strategies, see if they worked, make decisions about whether you're going to change. So there is no set length, I think, but there has to be enough time to make changes and actually see if it had an effect and then collect the data. And it has to be enough time that you would expect there to be an actual change. So I think anything less than a month would be too short, because it would be just really hard to kind of do all of that in a month. I mean, it could even be just a couple times a year. That's better than once a year, right? So there's some data, it might be very hard to collect, it might be hard to compile. You might not have the time to go through it. So a couple times, in the middle of the year is better than waiting till the end of the year, right? But quarterly also could make sense, right? You don't want to, you don't want to spend all your time just trying to compile the data. You really want to think about what is it that we're doing and have time to make those changes and then be reflective on what's happened. And it depends, what it is and how easy it is. So something like, for example, if you're using it for like an early warning indicator system, or looking at student attendance, you might have more regular data. Attendance data is ready pretty regularly. So once a month, you could even maybe meet more often, looking at students whose attendance has declined, making sure they don't fall behind, reaching out. But then for thinking about strategies, okay, you'll have your individual reaching out to students, finding out what happens. That's one use of data, right? It's giving direct support to students. But you're also at those attendance meetings, you're going to want to start thinking about patterns, or what could we do to support students more broadly, right? So you may see some students have, their particular issues that keep coming up, or you may think how can we support students, so that they're coming to school more frequently, either through messaging or transportation options, or you might be finding out certain students have certain issues. How can we deal with those? So with that, you're probably going to need some time to actually develop those strategies, try them out, and see if it made a difference, right? So it's different from working with individual students versus trying out new practices and new policies at the school. But it's related because you're probably going to be developing, thinking about new practices and policies as you're reaching out to individual students.
Thank you. I've got a couple of other questions that I've been collecting for you. Going back earlier in your presentation, Diamond asked, how do you decide what data is malleable? And how did you find out that student survey responses were better predictors than test scores?
Yeah. So with the second one, because that's just an easy one for me to answer, we did a study where some of my colleagues produced value add estimates for every school, which is basically looking at the degree to which the school you attend increases your test scores or your survey responses, holding constant everything else about the student, and making sure that there aren't other factors that are going to influence what we're attributing to school. So we're only looking at school effects. What is it that the school is affecting in terms of how students are responding on surveys, or the gains they're making on their tests, or it also looked at things like student behavior and grades. What is the actual school effect there? And and then looked at the schools that had these large effects. What are their outcomes of students, and looking at other cohorts of students. So again, we want to make sure we're not just crediting the school for their outcomes based on the students they serve. So really making sure we're holding all that constant, and then looked at college enrollment, high school graduation, tests. So that was focused on value add in ninth grade. So it looked at 11th grade test scores. It looked at incarceration rates of students. And what my colleagues found was that the schools that had high value add on ninth grade students' reports about their experiences in school, they had positive effects on all of those outcomes. Schools that had positive value add on ninth grade test scores, those schools had higher 11th grade test scores, but they weren't necessarily better on any of the other outcomes. And the schools that had high value add on ninth grade survey reports had just as strong 11th grade test scores in the end. I mean, schools had just as much an effect on students' test scores in the end, their long-term test scores. Again, it's about students' experiences in school, like, actually matter, and they matter a lot. And so that study was really designed to understand what matters most in terms of school effects on students. And school effects on test scores also matter, but if you're only paying attention to that, you're not paying attention to the thing that ultimately matters the most for students. Oh no, and now malleability. So how do you know if a metric is malleable? So this is a really difficult one. And I will say that, we don't hear a lot about malleability, but it is incredibly important. So there are different ways you can look at malleability. I mean, you can do it yourself if you have access to the data. Look at how much outcomes change for students over time in your school, and how different students' outcomes are. So for example, if you take students, I don't know, with test scores in the bottom quartile in third grade, what is the range of their test scores when they get to fifth grade, say? Or, what is the range of, if you take students that are getting C's, B's and C's in third grade, what are the grades they're getting in eighth grade? Or in fourth grade, right? How much do they change over time? But it's not just how much do they change, but how variable is that change? And what's the most that you see in terms of improvement compared to what's typical? So that's one way you can look at it, like how much, so like if you're setting goals around test scores, or around grades, or around attendance, well, the students that are improving the most, how much are they improving, right? look at that to see, what actually is realistic. Even better than just looking at your own data in your own school is to look at other schools. So look at other schools, if you have data, I can find data on other schools, that are, especially schools serving similar populations of students as yours, so that, you're feeling confident it's something happening at the school. Look at the schools that have the best outcomes, that are serving students the best. What are the kinds of gains that they're getting on those outcomes you care about, or what do they look like? Because you don't want to, set a goal that's higher than the highest performing schools. There's some data that you might get from vendors, like standardized test scores or maybe survey reports. Ask them to give you data on, the range of growth. What is, how much do students scores grow over time or grow from year to year, so that you can get a sense of what is reasonable if you're setting goals, and how much can you actually change this. One thing I find all the time is, people think, oh, if we improve, our test scores a lot, we'll get all students meeting proficiency, and then we'll have, students who will be better set for college. But they often have no idea of what actually is observed in the data in terms of like the schools that are most effective, how much are those test scores increasing? And if you showed the highest gains, what actually would be your change in your proficiency rate? And if you got all those students to proficiency, what would be the actual change in their later outcomes? How well they do in high school, how well they do in college. It's very hard to get that information. In fact, you can't find it. So I think, there's a lot to do in terms of asking the people that provide you with the data, but also then just looking at your own data to see, how much do students' outcomes actually change over time.
Got a couple
And I'm going
of
to keep pushing.
questions for you.
Mhm.
Thank you. So a couple of questions that seem related to me. Norman asked, how might we convince teachers who are hesitant or resistant to discuss data? And Melissa had a question, what kind of data do you recommend schools look at that can speak to teachers' practices? So question of what kind of data will speak to teachers, and how do you convince teachers to not be hesitant about looking at this data?
Yeah, I do think you need to set up safe environments for looking at data where it's okay to be vulnerable, and where it's being used for the purpose of reaching people's own goals, like improving their own effectiveness, better serving students, where it's focused on what they want to do, what they want to accomplish. How do we how how do we better help you support the students in your class? Again, it should be I think peers working together is highly effective, rather than, it kind of coming from top down. But it's setting up those structures. So setting up the time for people to meet around data, having protocols for how to talk about the data, and there are protocols that are out there for talking about data. Having those conversations. Again, if you focus on metrics that are malleable, it's very helpful. The more malleable the metric and the closer it is to teachers' work, the easier it's going to be to change. So some metrics that you might want to even start with are things like homework completion. Are students completing their homework, or you know because that's something that teachers are going to care about a lot. Teacher practice in terms of, supporting effective instructional practices. So maybe you want to, support the use of math talks or something. So you can get teachers, maybe observing each other's classes, getting tips from each other, find teachers who are doing it well versus teachers who need more support, getting them working together. But again, in a way where it's not very public, it doesn't feel like an evaluation. It's more of a teachers collaborating and working around data. Again, having the time, the structures, the non-evaluative kind of structures, and the protocols to have those conversations. can be effective. And when I say non-evaluative, I mean the conversations around data and changing practice are not evaluative, but it should be really clear how the data that people are working on and working to improve matter for students' outcomes and also matter for the school goals. Because ultimately, it's, you do want like some accountability, right? And so you're working on the data that you have in a way that's about supporting improvement, but knowing that it actually matters for the things that you're held accountable for, right? Not that the data you're working on and those practices matter for your accountability, but if you improve, you're going to look better, basically, and your students are going to do well. And that's another thing too. The conversations really should focus on not like improving the metrics, right? It's really about improving students' experiences, right? So the conversation needs to be how are we going to support students so that they're engaging more in class and so that's, they're feeling like the instruction is more rigorous or more relevant. And so it's the focus on what's underneath in terms of the conversations. How do we continuously get better? And also talking about the fact like no one is perfect. Like everyone has room to grow, right? And so, just being kind of honest and open about that and saying, okay, how do we better serve students? The more that the conversation is about what matters for students and how they're experiencing school, I think the more open people are too.
I've got one more question, Elaine, that we haven't addressed yet so far. Robin asked, how do teachers handle multiple data sets when they teach multiple classes in high school? And there's collaboration with common classes and then their own classes. Any recommendations there?
Yeah, I think you want to keep it as simple as possible because you don't want people to be overwhelmed. And so really think about what are the key elements in your data system that you want people to focus on and make sure it's kind of aligned. So people are focusing on particular, data, in their own work, but also in their teamwork. Again, keeping that focus. So you have lots of data and you can use that for contextual information. Like as you're working on, let's say, improving whatever the metrics are that you're really focused on improving, you're going to want contextual information to understand like why are we getting the outcomes we're getting, to develop, an understanding or some hypotheses about, what might be driving the metrics or what might matter for change. But don't focus on everything at once. Use that for kind of investigating, kind of digging deep, but keep your eye focused on just a few really key metrics. And I should say, again, I feel like data is the conversation starter. Like it's not the data that improves the outcomes, it's the conversations around the data. So you have your few key metrics that you're talking about, but you're always going to want to, as you're figuring out what to do next, that's always going to involve looking at more data and talking to people, right? So more data in terms of what other information is there, but also reaching out, talking to students, teachers, families, whoever might have information there to try to get, help you make sense of the data.
Thank you. I don't know if other people have questions so far that haven't been answered. Those are all of the questions that I've seen come up in the chat, though also people are sharing a lot of rich details about their own use of data. It's great.
Oh, wonderful. Sorry, now I'm reading it. Oh yeah, professional development around data use. That's great. Data team meetings with an agenda. Yes. Definitely an agenda that keeps people kind of focused on the goals of the meeting and data use. Bi-weekly to review student data. Yeah. Right. And like with the student data, I was saying that can be more frequent because there's like reaching out to individual students, while the strategy data, the strategy thinking would be monthly or, less frequent than that.
And we still have about 4 more minutes if people have other questions or if there are final comments, Elaine, that you wanted to share.
Oh yeah, I'm just looking at sorry, some of the comments someone wrote about the most powerful data teachers get is data they collect themselves about their instruction. However, it's often hard and cumbersome. So just completely agree, like that data that's really close to your practice is going to make the most. I do think teachers can work together to help each other, again, in terms of those practices. It's kind of, again, that could be something that teachers work together to figure out what are ways that we can collect the quick data, so you can do like those quick survey data, or you can, to have teachers help each other in terms of collecting, observation data. I don't know. There's, I think it's a great thing for teams to be working on together. And actually, I'd love to learn, what you found is really effective there. So yeah, I'm going to stop here. I feel like I'm constantly learning about great practices that are going on in schools. I hope that you find what I said useful, and that those of you who read my book find it useful. And I'd love to hear from you, and what you've discovered. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much, Elaine. This was a really wonderful and engaging presentation, and obviously a topic that lots of educators are thinking about right now. So thank you all. I hope you enjoy the rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you've joined us from.